My name is Andrea Coomber. I'm the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform, and it's my great privilege to chair this event today. We all know that prisons are in trouble. They're overcrowded, there's endless bang up, debt, drugs, violence, spiralling self-harm, violence. I've said it twice. And I know from the people who write to me from inside that spills over into frustration and anger and despair. And as a result, for lots of reasons, prisons are complex places and sometimes volatile places. And staff are sometimes required to make rapid decisions to maintain safety and order. And we know that force in prisons is sometimes necessary and justified, but we can't accept its use uncritically. We know from the Ministry of Justice's own evaluation that force is rising with a number of incidents, just as population pressures have risen with a system under strain. So there are serious questions about how often force is used, against whom, what the safeguards are, with what consequences. And today's Spotlight event sits in that space between looking at necessity and accountability for use of force. It's something very important to the Howard League. Those of you who are members and supporters of Howard League will know that we recently challenged the use of PAVA spray in English young offenders before the High Court, and I'm sure Gemma will talk about that a little later. But we've got an interest in this going back for decades and decades, and it's been 20 years since Lord Carlisle's report on the use of restraint and segregation in the children's estate. I'm pleased to introduce a truly expert panel to explore these issues. On the screen, we have Katuna Sinsadze, rather. I've just said it properly behind the scenes and now I messed it up. A human rights activist and a co-director of the Zahid Mubarak Trust, whose fantastic work will need little introduction to this audience. Also on the screen is Gemma Abbott, who is the Howard League's legal director. You will have seen her writing blogs and various things from us over time. And she's been key in our litigation on the PAVA spray and also follows the expanding use of force amongst other matters for us. And off screen, but still very much with us, is Mike, who I've known since we worked together years ago at Warren Hill, who's now in the community, but has personal experience of a variety of prisons, young offenders and adults prisons. And he'll be here grounding our conversation in real life experience today. To allow him to speak freely, Mike's chosen to be off camera, but we're delighted to have him with us. As ever, we have some housekeeping matters. We'll begin with a brief introduction. I'll then ask the panelists some questions. There'll be time for questions from the audience. Please put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than in the chat box. You can use the chat box to introduce yourself, make comments, and our staff will post things in there from time to time. And please note also that the event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. So just to ground the conversation in a little bit of the kind of what we're talking about, we've got three quick slides to set out some baselines. The first slide, please, Noor. What is the use of force? According to the MOJ, it's the intentional physical intervention by a prison officer on a person in prison that aims to manage, control or restrain that person. We know that this envisages a range of techniques from control and restraint to handcuffs, use of weapons. There's a very broad term and it can be used in a wide variety of circumstances, whether that's escorting somebody back to their cell, which actually is a lot of use of force, to causing serious pain, sometimes injury. And we know that it can be pain-inducing. Force is only lawful if it's necessary, reasonable, proportionate, and to the seriousness of the circumstances, and that force shouldn't be used more than is necessary. At the same time, we know that it is unlawfully and inappropriately used regularly in prisons. And you just need to pick up any inspection reports, really, and you'll see examples of that. I'm reminded of the 2024 report of Weatherby, where it was revealed that in the 9 times that pain-inducing techniques had been used on the children at Weatherby, the independent review panel found that in every instance it had been used inappropriately, which in our language is unlawfully. Second slide, please. The context of where force is used. We know that our prisons are overcrowded, that there's severe prison overcrowding across England and Wales, Then in reception prisons, that's 53% of people are overcrowded. Many of these are remand jails. I've this morning come from one of those London jails, which suffer real problems of population and all the stress that brings to the people living double bunked in cells originally intended for a single Victorian person. They're unsafe. We know that violence, deaths in custody, and self-harm have all increased dramatically in recent years. And there are serious questions around staffing, with a lot of experienced staff having left over the last 10, 15 years, very low retention rates, very high numbers of staff members being lost to sickness. So prisons don't actually have the staff that they need to do their jobs. Unfortunately, instead of tackling, and all of these pressures result in rising temperatures and stress in prisons. But instead of tackling those underlying issues, the response of government increasingly seems to be escalating use of force, which is what we're going to talk about today. Finally, we need to think about who's on the receiving end, and we'll talk about this as the conversation goes on. Data on the use of force is not routinely published. Sorry, the next slide, please, Noah. But the recent HMPPS evaluation of use of force between 2018 and 23 found areas of concern. So they showed links between force being used with experiences linked to age, gender, and ethnicity, that women tend to experience highest rates of force overall. That's very often due to being like self-harm. A lot of incidents of women are self-harm. Black men face elevated rates of certain use of techniques, so like PAVA and batons, and that there is significant variation in its use. I think Mike perhaps will talk to this, across different establishments, different cultures, it talks about in the report, and with that is changing variations in quality of assurance across different establishments. And numbers of incidents, techniques used, use of body-worn camera, proportionate of force that is planned or unplanned, all varies across establishment. Finally, who's missing from the stats? We know that Muslim prisoners, the PES, sorry, next slide, Noah. The HMPPS evaluation didn't consider religion, but we know from other sources, our friends at Maslahah, FOIs over the years, that Muslim people have force used against them disproportionately. And we also know that robust data is not collected on people with disabilities. But again, we understand that people with disabilities are particularly at risk from the use of force and its impacts. So that's just a bit of background. And quickly move in, sorry it's taken so long, to start off with Mike, to kind of ground the conversation in what this is like in real life. Mike, I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about the first time you ever experienced force in young offenders.
Yeah, that's fine. So I've only ever done one jail sentence. So me going into prison was new. I got a big sentence. I got 16 years. So that was daunting, especially at 18 years old. And within the first week of arriving, my experience of excessive force or even uncalled for force was me refusing to give my TV to a member of staff because I was on remand and they wanted to take my TV, and I said, "What are you taking my TV for?" So then obviously he just pressed his bell. There was no conversation. He pressed his bell. About 15 officers came, restrained me, and then he's then got the TV laughed and stamped on my head after I was already on the floor restrained. So obviously I've kicked off now. I've really lost it. And I ended up getting in trouble for it even more because I started kicking off and what do they call it? You're resisting. But I wasn't resisting. I only started resisting when my head got stamped on. I ended up doing about 6 weeks down the block, down I don't know what to call it now, actually, the CCU or something like that. CSU.
Yeah. CSU.
Yeah, CSU. And then from then on, it was just kind of downhill because now your name's spoken about and the staff don't like you. So then you kind of get singled out constantly. And when I first went to my first prison, it was in a place where my victims' friends were staff, so it became very difficult just to do basic stuff like go education, pick up things from reception. Like I'm on remand, I've not even been found guilty yet, regardless, even if so, like I'm there to do my time, rehabilitate and educate, and the staff are meant to be there for to keep the public safe and ultimately keep you safe as well. But that's not what I see happen. You get very few staff that actually care about their job, and the whole point of prison in my eyes is, yeah, there's an aspect of punishment there, but the main thing is to rehabilitate someone and get them out, because ultimately everyone's going to end up getting out eventually. It's how you want them people to get out and how you want them people to see society and authority in the future, because all you're going to do by doing that is putting a negative spin on them and making them get out with hate and animosity towards authoritative figures that you're trying to take off anyway.
Yeah. So that initial kind of experience of force immediately, it sounds like, affected your kind of trust in the system, or like your experience.
100% for years, for a good 7 years, because it was crazy, because they're saying that you shouldn't blanket coat every prison officer with just one bad apple, but that's exactly what they do with prisoners. They
Yeah.
get a few bad eggs that don't really care, and then you blanket coat everybody and treat them with disdain before you even get to learn about them or see that actually they're trying to change or trying to implement some change in their life.
Yeah. And did you complain about this use of force? Like, was there any?
No. So, and then this tangles in with my upbringing as well, because this is where I think prison staff get away with it a lot, because a lot of people who go to prison have morals, whether they're positive morals, they're morals nonetheless, and talking to the authorities and things like that is a no-no. Especially in prison, you can get yourself into more trouble communicating with authorities, whether you're classing it as snitching or whatever. Even complaining about other staff, people can see it's like you don't talk to staff no matter what. You don't tell them anything. It's like, as a kid, you brought up saying don't tattletale. That literally stems into something greater than something innocent when you're a kid. Don't tattletale on your brother. To we don't talk to police, we don't talk to prison officers, we don't talk our business. And culturally as well, as black people, we're told not to bring, like, air out our laundry to people outside the family. So that in itself, like, unconsciously, you're deliberately not saying anything anyway, and then staff get away with it.
Yeah, because you don't have confidence in, well, culturally you're not wanting to complain, and then you don't have confidence that anything possible will happen. Did your experience, the way you, I mean, I appreciate that you ended up becoming a person who didn't end up having that much trouble with prison eventually, but did the way you experienced and witnessed use of force change as you were going through the system?
Yeah, definitely. So
In
it
what
really
way?
did. So different establishments are definitely different with their use of force and how they implement it. Like higher security prisons like Garth, Belmarsh, places like that are very different. So Garth is more relaxed. You got a lot of people. I think you can't go there with a minimum of 6 years. So a lot of people are doing quite a long time. A lot of people want to just get on with their sentence. So I think about 80% of prisoners in Garth are doing above 10 years. So it's a different mindset. A lot of them have already been in 5 years. They just want to just chill. It's
Yeah.
not like it's not like a youth club now. Like you're actually having to find roots. You have to lay your roots. It might not be your home, but it's your home for now. Like it's where you're living for the next 10, 15 years. So you have to have a different mindset. So it creates a more relaxed atmosphere. Obviously, it does go off at some times, and you do get the odd knobhead, mind my language, but you get the odd knobhead of everybody. But like YOs, yeah, it can get a bit ruthless in YOs, especially with the way staff treat you, because they'll just take you to the CSU to isolate you from other prisoners from getting involved and just jump on you there. They'll get like 5 staff come in, jump on you there. Juveniles, they were really sneaky about it because when I was down the CSU, someone next door to me came from juveniles. I think he was like 16, and they actually put the mattress over him and started hitting him over the mattress so it didn't mark him.
God.
Yeah.
I wonder, before we go into Katuna and we'll come around again, is there anything on those slides that surprised you at all? Like, or did you know the
Not
idea of
really. Yeah, not
no?
really. Not really. Like because like I've seen it all. Like I said, I've done 17 years in prison. I have seen it all. And even like you said, like during like the second half of my sentence, I kind of started to just focus on myself, isolate myself away from everybody, and focus on rehabilitating and getting out to my kids. So like a lot of staff could see, like, just leave him alone. Like he's trying to do positive stuff. I'm doing open university. I'm doing this, doing that. I'm trying to move on to different places where I can get better things. I was half getting left alone, but you still get the odd member of staff that want to try and pull you in and antagonize you and talk down to you. That always going to happen. But then I think one thing that changed was I started to challenge that. It created few problems in the beginning because they'd just give you a nicking and say that you was being argutive, abusive, whatever. But then when you actually break it down and you sit in front of a governor, it's about being able to articulate yourself because they think you're idiots. They think you've come to prison and you're nothing but like scum and you don't know how to articulate yourself. So when you do, it gets them a little bit more frustrated. But you can get your point across to someone who's more understanding, like a deputy governor or something like that. Like, actually, all I did was this.
Yeah. And you did have experience of good staff over time that helped you through your sentence, didn't you?
Few, yeah. I've had two good staff that probably without them I wouldn't be out now.
Yeah. Great.
Like
Thanks,
they
Mike. We're
really
going to move
brought
on
me
to
home.
Katuna and we'll come back
Yeah.
to you later.
No.
Katuna, I mean, incredibly, it's now been 25 years since the murder of Zahid Mubarak in Feltham and a racist attack. How do you see through your work every day, how do you see racism manifesting in the use of force in 2026?
Thank you, Andrea. I think in terms of kind of going a little bit back, answering this question is about what kind of change do we see around addressing racism in the first place? Because from my point of view, and I'm going to try to make this argument a bit more stronger as I speak, is that we can never address issue of racism or use of force or any other parts of prison experience without looking at how race equality is viewed. And when it comes to what has changed, this is the kind of a most frequently asked question people ask me when they hear about the trust. And I usually answer back by asking, what does change look like? And how do we measure it? No doubt, if you ask the same question to officials, the answer would be that we came a long way. And we have. I'd like to acknowledge that some of the positive changes happening. My colleague, I was speaking this morning, he reminded me, he served his time in 90s, and he usually talks about his experience when he first time walked in the reception. First thing he saw was a racist poster, which nobody challenged and nobody thought there was a problem with that. And certainly, based on my experience, I can wholeheartedly say the vast majority of staff I met through my work would not accept this type of blatant racism for various reasons. And it's no longer widespread practice. However, racism and racial discrimination have transformed into more subtle forms, covert racism, which is more prevalent, and arguably it has no lesser detrimental impact on people's experiences.
What does that look like then?
Yeah, and that's probably the hardest part to evident, because it is based on people's perceptions. And I always remind staff as well as people in prison who we interact with, that's our right to define what is racism, because that's what the definition of racism is, perceived, defined by the victim and or somebody who witnessed the incident. And I think for a very long time, we've been denied, and people have been denied that right of perception, how they perceive certain treatment. And I think that's where covert racism really flourishes, because you don't have direct evidence of it. And it's very hard in prisons, we know this, and I'm sure audience who are listening to this know it's very hard to have direct evidence of what's happening to you, how you're experiencing. And some of the things Mike was talking about, even if he has a direct evidence, there are various reasons why people would not document it and complain. So it's really hard. So I think in terms of change-wise, Andrea, I would say things will change, including around use of force, once we allow people who are at the receiving end of this treatment to define what change looks like. Because most of them, people speak about change like almost it happens somewhere in isolation. But we do know that it happens starting from decision making and how this decision making is implemented. And it has to be felt by people and seen by people who live and work in prisons. And that's where we have not seen any changes really. And however uncomfortable this sounds, neither published data, as shown on the slides, nor lived experience, as Mike spoke about, of ethnic minority people in prison, give me confidence to answer this question any differently, that nothing really has changed in terms of experiences. And if I answer this any differently, I will be disingenuous to people who
You're doing a disservice to people who are in the front line.
Yes. Sorry, I just wanted to come back in terms of use of force specifically. I think my biggest problems, and you did mention this on the slide, is, of course, lots of issues, because use of force being used disproportionately against ethnic minority people, it's a historic problem. You can go back to 3 decades, and the data shows increasing number. Problem is that 15 years ago, I could see a public data. Whether there was an issue with that, yes, that was a separate part. But at the moment, we can't have a data, which means that we don't have details which are very important to know, such as what type of incidents these are, is it planned, unplanned? These all makes huge difference.
And why is that? I mean, is that because the data is not captured? Is it because it's not shared? It's not held centrally? Like, what is the reason for that?
So I would say, if you ask me this as a personally who has been involved in this, I do believe it's not a rocket science to collect data. And I think we've been waiting now. So the last published data accessible to a member of public, interested member of public, such as me, would be going back to 2012. So that is a good 14 years not having data. And I don't believe that if we have a wheel, we cannot fix data publication. Certainly there was a way 14 years ago to publish it. So I think the issue is about nervousness about explaining disparities. And I think that's where the problem comes, the second part of the problem, because we have to explain it. They have to explain why there is a disparity in the system. But at the same time, are they asking right people the questions about why there is a racial disparity in the first place? People like Mike with lived experience should be around the table. Experts should be around the table. And I think that we should just go to basics really when it comes to research. Ask those right questions. Where is data? Why it's not published? And why? Because when it's not transparent, it is open for interpretation. And sometimes that feeds into a narrative which is not helpful, where ethnic minority individuals might be portrayed as more violent just by presenting data. So that's where the explanation part is so key.
Yeah. You've done work in the past that shows that a very small percentage of complaints against officers are upheld. I mean, what's the impact of that in practice on the people you work with who feel like they've been unfairly treated?
So I think the research you are referring, Andrea, was Still Not Fair Response, which we published in 2017 based on the discrimination complaints data from 8 prisons. And that was also following the similar study done by Dr. Kim and Edgar in 2010. And it was interesting because despite of 8 years difference between the first study and our follow-up study, the findings were astonishingly and frustratingly very similar. So race discrimination complaints against staff or prisoners had 1% chance to be upheld, which greatly undermines the confidence in the system. And that, go into more detail, that was based on 4 out of 8 prisons. If you happen to be in the remaining 4, which were part of our study, you had 0% chance your complaint to be upheld. So we scrutinize discrimination complaints in prisons. We've done it since April 2010, when very first discrimination complaint landed. I remember it vividly, and we do it through the external scrutiny and support project. So when we scrutinize discrimination complaints across 60 prisons at the moment, and we see every single of them, we provide feedback to leaders, and we base it on good, bad, and ugly. So we obviously scrutinize them against the published policy standards. And I can say, based on past 16 years experience of being heavily involved in this project, that I have seen the positive difference when scrutiny can make. I have seen a real potential when properly developed and implemented discrimination complaint system can do, but I have seen more bad and ugly. And I would say it probably takes real leadership to own when you are ready to hear what experts have to say, including the lived experience, and it takes even more courage to do something about it. And I think that's the biggest part about the problem, because if I were to conduct this study now, nearly 10 years later, and measuring the confidence in the system and how, especially complaints around racial discrimination, I honestly think that it will not be too dissimilar from the previous report findings. And I think the fundamental problem around this is that, similar to use of force, what we referred earlier, is that its system has got problem of seeing problem for what it is, acknowledging problem, and do something about it. And I think without those 3 steps, it will be very difficult to address it meaningfully, whether it's through use of force or any other areas. And we do know, people who work in prisons and organizations such as yourself, us, we do know that disproportionately does not stop at use of force only. It manifests in different areas of prisons as well.
Great. I will bring Gemma in at this stage. Gemma, obviously our lawyers hear nearly every day from children and young people on the receiving end, sometimes of force on the legal advice line. Could you tell us what they share with us, and how force is different for that group of our kind of young clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've obviously, as you said, Andrea, been interested in the use of force and children and young people's experience of it in particular for a very long time, like commissioning the Carlisle report now 20 years ago. And so I was rereading it last night and was struck that there obviously have been changes in that time in the estate and in the way that force is used. But actually, there's been lots of things that haven't changed at all. And my team were kind enough to pull together a list, sort of some of the calls that we've had from children and young people in custody that focused on use of force in particular. And yes, it really just struck me the lack of change and progress that we've made there. It makes really harrowing reading. So we hear from young people who are restrained regularly, often by more than one officer, as like Mike said. We hear from young people who are suddenly restrained. It comes out of nowhere, escalates incredibly quickly. There's no sense of trying to de-escalate things, to talk things through first. Happens incredibly quickly, and it happens with disproportionate force. Young people who are assaulted by officers, so they're punched and kicked, resulting in injury. Chips, teeth, broken noses, facial injuries, head injuries, scars. and healthcare is often insufficient and late if it comes at all. And I think sort of pervading all of those examples, and they're horrific, and pervading all of them is just this really strong sense of harm and how little trust and safety, security you could feel in that situation when officers have that power over you. And I think underpinning all of the examples too, which is also something I think I heard echoed in what Mike told us, was just this absence of fairness and justice, a sense that you're being punished, and that actually, far from having confidence that officers might be disciplined for the misuse of force, actually, you know, we've heard of young people being told, well, these things happen and you brought it on yourself. And
these kids who are like, most of them traumatized already. I mean, as Mike's already been suggesting.
Exactly. The idea that this is a rehabilitative, safe space for children and young people to come back out into our communities and have had a positive experience. I mean, that is not what is happening. These are re-traumatizing experiences. And I think also that the idea that you could exist in this world without being on constant alert, like that, none of us can survive that without that being further traumatizing. I think so. I think it's not really surprising in that context either that monitoring and scrutiny bodies find there to be misuse of force as well. And you alluded to it in the context of that Weatherby report, Andrea, and I was just looking back at the independent review restraint panel as well, and you know, was reminded. So, for example, the year ending 2024, they found that of all the incidents where pain-inducing techniques had been used against children in young offenders institutions and in Oak Hill Secure Training Centre, 65% of them were outside the policy. That euphemism for, as you say, Andrea, what I would call unlawful. Pain
64%, did you say?
Sorry, 65%.
Yeah.
And there's really serious concerns as well with who's on the receiving end. So for children and young people in custody, if you're Black and or if you're Muslim, you're more likely to have force used against you. And although the data on disability is lacking, slightly better than for the adult state, what is available does seem to show that there's increased disproportionality against children and young people with disabilities when higher levels of force are used, so depending on the type of force, and that includes pain-inducing techniques. And that's one of the reasons why, so we were going to come on to it, that we brought the legal action to challenge the rollout of PAVA spray into YYs in England, because we knew that force was already being misused and used disproportionately. And so we knew, we can all see, we can all know how harmful PAVA is going to be as well. And unfortunately, the case wasn't successful in stopping the rollout. But in response to our challenge, at least, we have seen some sort of safeguards and mitigations. In particular, the original decision was that PAVA would be rolled out to every officer and be carried as it is in the adult estate as part of PPE, and that has not happened in the children's estate. Instead, it's only certain trained officers, custodial managers and others or use of force coordinators who are allowed to use it. But I think the fact that the judge in our case seemed really reassured by the monitoring and safeguards that existed, and that he was really comforted, it seemed, reading the judgment, that those would somehow prevent misuse, that would somehow mean that the use of this pain-inducing technique was different. Well, we see that those same monitoring processes and safeguards don't keep children safe today. So I don't have that confidence. And we're monitoring the use as best we can. Data gaps are not just a problem in the adult estate. The data is better for the children's estate, but it's not entirely easy to get a clear picture of what's happening on the ground on a day-to-day basis with PAVA, but we're doing our best and we will monitor it. And I think those who, you know, in HMPPS and the MOJ, they know that, and they are monitoring it too. And we'll continue to do that, and we will take further legal action if it's appropriate to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect our members will already understand that we will not be giving up on PAVA spray or an escalating use of force. And frankly, I think that the threat of the Howard League watching the whole time is hopefully will motivate better decision making and deployment. I mean, you've mentioned obviously the rollout of PAVA in children's prisons, but it's more than that, isn't it? I mean, the direction of travel, the government's committed 15 million to new tools, like to new weapons, effectively. Can you tell us a bit more about those kind of escalating plans for use of force?
Yeah, I can. So, yeah, you look at sort of rising violence in the prison estate and you ask yourself how to deal with this. And it would appear the answer at the moment on the government side is, well, with more violence and more weapons, because it really is only going in one direction. PAVA spray in children's prisons, yes, and now we've got tasers in adult prisons, or at least the authorization of tasers. So they were first given to the National Tactical Response Group in July last year. That's a sort of centralized body of sort of specially trained officers who can come in emergency situations and deal with really serious scale unrest or disruption. They were authorized, they'd been doing what was called a non-operational trial prior to that point, and then they have been doing subsequently an operational trial. The government said they'd evaluate the findings of that before making any further decisions about the proliferation of tasers, but despite them not actually having been used by the NTRG in that trial, David Lammy nonetheless authorised a further rollout of tasers in September last year. So as you said, investing £15 million in body armour and also for tasers for up to 500 officers. So we can see already, you think you are hearing about the thin end of the wedge, and actually in a matter of months, we were already somewhere beyond the thin end of the wedge. I think the other issue is that we hear about plans to train up local response teams in certain prisons where the national tactical response teams can't get there quickly enough, which I think have existed in the past, and I believe that they'll be brought back in. But those teams will be those who are trained to use tasers. So we started with the National Tactical Response Group. It's already moving locally.
The National Tactical Response Group, though, does have, like, they're trained and they have lower rates of I think they perhaps aren't even disproportionate in the way they use force. Like, there is like a different assessment perhaps of how they use force compared to.
I think there is. It tends to be much more planned, and I think that helps. There is very little transparency. If I'm honest, all that I know about the National Tactical Response Group comes from Freedom of Information requests, which I've submitted. I think they've been deployed more regularly in recent years, which I think corresponds to crisis in the prison estate, regarding an rising instance of violence. They've been deployed more often, but yes, my understanding is that they don't share issues around disproportionality on grounds of ethnicity or religion in the way that force that's used by officers in the ordinary course. There are those concerns. It tends to be used disproportionately against younger people, and I don't believe that they have any insight into how it affects people with disabilities. So concerned about that. And I think that what's really significant is that I really think we're seeing the introduction of tasers as a political tool instead of in response to an evidence base that they're needed. And I think it's pretty telling that they've been working up the operational requirement for tasers after David Lammy made the announcement. I think we could all agree that's the wrong way around. And I think whilst there's been a lot of focus within the MOJ and HMPPS on tasers, actually back in 2024, we saw the Ministry of Justice investing in some other less lethal weapons, as they're called. They'd be called non-lethal weapons if they were, but they're not. So they're euphemistically called less lethal weapons with a view to enabling their use in prisons. So that includes pepper balls, which are very small balls of PAVA spray that can be deployed using small caliber impact launchers. And that will allow you to get PAVA, so to dispense it further rather than just a canister. And also weapons that are called FN303 pistols, which are another means of delivering PAVA, which have really checkered safety records across their use in other jurisdictions. We've also heard about large PAVA, which I understand to be we've got canisters of PAVA this size, I understand in my head, I always picture somebody doing the weed killing in
Ghostbusters.
the garden, basically, whether it's sort of strapped on your back, but it's a way of inundating an entire space with PAVA, saturating a cell or an area. I mean, lastly, I've been maybe doing too many FOIs, but it's the only way to find out anything about data. Sometimes it feels some heavily redacted minutes provided by the National Police Chiefs Council, who do talk about less lethal weapons. Very often we see the MOD piggybacking off what their Home Office does in the policing context. And I've seen some references to something called Taser drone, which I don't know if it's envisaged for use in prisons or not, but I think in prisons or in our communities, I think anything of that nature would be of deep concern. So I think,
Sure.
you know, as we found in our litigation on PAVA, there's no evidence that these escalating ways of inflicting pain actually reduce violence in prisons. And in many respects, we think it makes things worse, certainly in terms of relationships and trust. And so when you've got the context of inappropriate use of force, disproportionate use of force, problems with lack of staff training, inadequate use of body-worn video cameras, all of these problems, I think all of this proliferation of weaponry and sort of more extreme ways of inflicting force, I think they're really worrying.
Let's come quickly back to Katrina. I wonder, Katrina, if you can talk to us about what you think the alternatives are to this sort of escalating use of force. Are you still there? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. So I probably will sound like a broken radio because that's what we've been advocating for alongside people and organizations like yourselves in terms of alternatives. And there are alternatives, and alternatives are evidence, what evidence based, evidence would tell us would work, and they are around building positive relationships between staff and prisoners, and I think looking at where we're going, as Gemma mentioned, we're going quite opposite. So I really would like to see any evidence of how escalating these techniques and providing more defense mechanisms to officers would help in any way to reduce violence. What helps in reducing violence? To understand the context, why it happens in the first place, involving people, asking the right questions, and relationships are most important thing. And unfortunately, it does feel that prison service is investing in wrong things. I had conversation with people in staff who are equally quite fearful about what the next step is, because very rarely they want to have weapons because they know people in their care might adapt. And interestingly, I have not looked into this more details, but a few days ago I came across that Scottish prison system is rolling out and looking at the alternatives and kind of pain minimizing techniques and so forth. But for me, the baseline is really building staff-prisoner relationships. That is basic. That works. We know evidence tells us that works. And I'd like to be convinced otherwise by evidence.
Mike, can I ask you to come back on? Thank you, Katrina. You sent me a message through the chat when Katrina was talking about complaints, saying you had thoughts. Share your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts of what's just been spoken about, and with what Gemma said, to be fair. So with the equalities and the DERF forms, I was actually
so the DERF
ambassador.
forms, just explain what a DERF form is, Mike, for people who haven't been in the system.
It's a procedure you use in prison to report discrimination. It used to be equality and diversity, but then it just turned to equalities. And I forgot exactly what it stands for. It's been a little second. But I was actually the ambassador for discrimination for about 10 years. I still am now. I work with a man called Kieran Manners. He runs ISCRI, so he audits DERF forms in prisons. And the main thing that, and someone wrote in the questions as well, so I'll answer them both at the same time. It's really hard to put a complaint in or a DERF in because some people, something's happened to them, so they're really emotional. So when they put it on the DERFs, it don't come across the best, or they get so frustrated when they get the response, they don't follow the procedure, which then ultimately gets dismissed, doesn't get upheld. So like, you could put a complaint in, and they'll give you like some palm off response, hoping that you don't then follow the next process, which is then a Comp 1A or an appeal, because that's when the true complaint happens, because then it goes to somewhere higher up like a governor. Because at the moment, a normal surface level complaint or DERF only goes to a superior officer, an SO, which are ultimately on the wing, on the units, with the staff that are best friends, probably going to have a pint after and have a laugh about it. So nothing actually gets done. It kind of goes in a full circle within themselves, like, oh, look what this idiot's
that breeds lack of confidence in
yeah,
the systems.
exactly. So then obviously what I started to do, which will probably answer a question that John and Margaret had, was I started to sit down with prisoners and help them write their DERFs out for them and take the emotions out of it and put the facts in there and what you're actually complaining about and what you want done. And then I've just tried to let them know, like, listen, don't expect nothing from this complaint. You're going to get palmed off, because that's what they want to do, because if they upheld it, then it's another thing on their record. So then you go past that first complaint and then you go into your Comp 1As and you have to get to the governor, because when you get to the governor, now he has to do something about it. Now you have to investigate, because the next thing is an ombudsman and he doesn't want it leaving the prison. So it's really about educating people that if you really have an issue and there's something wrong, just follow the process, because people are just not putting complaints in no more, because they're like, they get to the first response, oh, fuck this, like, I'm sick of it, like nothing's happening. But this is what they want. They want you to like be discouraged from continuing the process, because ultimately when you continue the process, then something actually happens. And then alternatively, what happens as well is when you put a complaint in, staff do tell other staff, oh, he just put a complaint in about you, and you do get stitched up. Your canteen sheet will go missing for a few weeks. Like you'll send a mail out and your mail somehow doesn't get received. Like these are,
I mean,
that's
it is a case of, I mean, I always think about this, prisons being places where they're obviously behind, most people don't ever get to go into them. They're behind scrutiny. Media doesn't have access. You can't easily, and if you complain, you literally are biting the hand that's feeding you, literally feeding you. You're just 100%. hugely vulnerable. And they're the kind of conditions in which impunity breeds, that
100%.
people can get away with stuff. And did you you said you had thoughts about what Gemma had said also?
Yeah. So I had a conversation with you yesterday about this. So staff had this gamification where they could see how many twist ups, so how many times they could restrain a prisoner through the month, and they were literally betting on it. A governor, actually, fair dues to him, I won't say the governor's name or the prison, but he actually sacked a few prison officers because he found out what was happening, got evidence, and it wasn't on, because they was deliberately going out their way to antagonize prisoners, to then give them a reason to bend them up and use force, put them in segregation and give them nickings, give them adjudications, and then win money at the end of the month at their pub or wherever they go, which is actually disgusting. And with what Gemma said, like, the use of force only escalates use of force. Like it's like at a football match, yeah? They tell you not to send in riot squad and people armed up, because all you do is entice violence. They send people to deter a situation, just have a talk. Don't go in uniform, don't, like, not uniform like body armor or anything like that, because you rile things up. What do you think's going to happen in a prison if you're walking around with a bodysuit, with a taser, thinking that it's a new toy that you can use whenever you want, and start walking around with the different kind of, if you want to say, swagger? Like, you're gonna create more distance between prisoner staff relations.
Yeah, I mean, I heard that a lot last year when there was started to be talk about body-worn armour and tasers and stuff. And a number of prisons I was going to, talking to prison officers on wings, they were like, this is terrible. Like, I don't want this stuff. There are already enough barriers between me and the people in my care without having me have to carry, more weapons or look like I'm anticipating that people are going to stab me. Like, just like really serious levels of concern. And obviously there are definitely, undoubtedly, unfortunately, the kind of officers that you're talking about, or people who are putting bets on harming people. Equally, there are lots of prison officers who really feel really uncomfortable, and it came across in the use of force evaluation, feel very uncomfortable about, whether they should be, for example, using force to stop a woman self-harming. Like they lack comfort with a lot of that. So it is a broad church. We have to go to questions. Thank you very much, Mike. And helpfully, Mike has answered a couple of the questions already in the chat, which is a first I've ever had doing these events. So thank you, Mike. Other questions, let's have a look. So there's a question here from Jane about the Scottish prison thing, which I think Rob has put into the chat. Gemma, do you have any thought? I mean, it's early days, but thoughts?
Yeah, I saw that in the news this week, and I can see actually that Dr. Frank Slogan is in the chat, and I believe he was involved in this process with the SPS, with the Scottish Prison Service. So, and has made a comment in the chat about it looking sort of, it's based on a full restraint reduction model. It's not just about a change in techniques. And I think, I think I would defer to him on the technique specifically, but what I just thought it was really interesting in it, that people are thinking about a trauma-informed approach to restraint, and it's like acknowledging that there are going to be circumstances in which people need to be restrained, but how can you A, minimize when those incidents occur, and B, approach it in a way that de-escalates and is the least harmful for people involved. And I found the video quite challenging at the top end of that BBC article, if I'm honest, but there's a reality of it, I think, is hard, and I think it's important that we all grapple with it. But I found it quite refreshing, to be honest, to read an article about experiences in prison that actually spoke with humanity about the experiences of people who might find themselves on the receiving end, and how that would change the way that they responded to having force used against them, and how it meant that it would be appropriate to approach having to use restraint. And I just thought that the difference between this model that the SPS, that the Scottish Prison Service is investigating, versus the kind of escalation and the proliferation of force that we've just been talking about in England and Wales, I just thought that difference was quite stark. And I would really like to see, south of the border, not just because I'm Scottish, but I would really like to see south of the border that this sort of initiative was being explored, and looking at the evidence that we already know exists, as Katuna has said, of what works, which is not tasers and PAVA and batons. I think I don't know enough about the specifics of it, being honest, to comment on that. But in terms of a sort of sense of direction and culture and the motivations behind it, I think I would much prefer to see that happening in England and Wales as well.
Katuna, I wonder whether you might be able to answer John's question, which is about, I guess, that where responsibility lies, and how that could be improved, how accountability, I guess, could be improved.
Well, accountability question. Where do I start with this, Andrea? Because I think in terms of, it's so interesting because we did some mini study which we have not published because it was in response to looking at, again, discrimination complaints practice in Western Europe. And what we found is that in England and Wales, our prison system has got more accountability, kind of independent bodies visiting for monitoring and inspection than any other service and system in Western Europe, which was very interesting. It's interesting practice because do I think that these measures are very effective based on what people tell us, or what do we see? And I believe they are not as effective as they are supposed to be. And a very interesting one is in terms of, for example, when some independent bodies produce repeat recommendations, and I was reading a report which had repeat recommendation for the past 5 years. And you kind of feel like, where do you draw a line and ask the question, it's something is not working, I'm repeating recommendation as an independent body and nobody is listening. And I think that's where some of the current existing accountability measures need to be reevaluated for their effectiveness. And I think coming from the place where we started as a Zahid Mubarak Trust following the Zaid's murder and so forth, we felt that there was lack of accountability even following Zaid's murder. It was very hard to admit why that happened. And it took family to go to House of Lords and get public inquiry to uncover that it was 186 failures, which could have saved Zaid's life. And I remember vividly when I joined the trust 16 years ago, I worked with a number of ministers who repeatedly assured us and the family that the lessons are learned and another tragedy would not happen. We had, in fact, meeting with Minister when Nick Hardwick, then Chief Inspector, published thematic on the implementing Mubarak recommendations. And I remember the confidence in Minister's statement about this won't happen again. However, in 2020, we had Sandeep Guman murdered in a very similar circumstances as Zaid did 20 years prior to the case. And again, question for me is, where is accountability in any of these cases? I think the issue for me really in terms of accountability is brave leadership. Leadership which does things for the right reasons. And I think as we're speaking about.
And do you mean leadership within prisons, within the system?
Yeah, that's an interesting. So that's the thing, Andrea, because I think I used to think that it was top down. It is definitely top down because the examples and strategies and so forth has to be set at the top level, but it's leadership at all levels as well, because everybody who goes to prisons will now, out of 131, I believe now, types of prisons we've got at the moment, it has to be governors setting the example. It has to be the leadership of people who work and live there as well. It has to be encouraged because that's how it works. But I think for me, the issue really is about how system at the moment is designed to be reactive, not proactive, because it responds to tragic incidents, but it never invests in preventative measures. And that's the part of the topic we're discussing in terms of use of force and preventing violence. It's not more weapons, it is the preventative, why this happens in the first place. And I feel like they're not asking the right questions or not listening to the right people.
Yeah. Can we get a mic on this same question? I mean, this has actually come up in a separate question here from Maria Elena around leadership in prisons. Mike, I mean, do you get a sense that prison governors or prison leaders made a difference in these cultural kind of things?
Yeah, sometimes. The funniest thing is actually what you'll see a lot in prisons is, even though there is a culture of prisoner versus staff, a lot of prisoners, even though they'll say they don't like staff, they'll respect certain staffing authorities that just keep it straight with them, be honest, and kind of just like, if someone's done something wrong, this is what I'm going to do. But like, just fair, ultimately, I think, without going into it too much, like, as long as the deputy or the CM is fair, people kind of just like, you get a safer wing. And you notice that on different wings, because you'll see how bad staff are by how prisoners act.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that you should be giving prisoners everything and all of this. It's about fair treatment and humanely, more than anything.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions here. I think, Gemma, you might want to answer. There's one about the lasting physiological side effects of PAVA spray, and what we know about them. And then another around one of your favorite things other than your children, data and FOIs. If you could perhaps answer those questions.
Yeah, sure. So on the lasting physiological impacts of PAVA, there is a bit of a paucity of evidence out there, if I'm honest, but there is so the Faculty of Forensic Science and Legal, haven't got that acronym correct, but they have done a kind of a guide that the government relies on the health implications of PAVA, and in there, sort of mostly around physical health, and then it talks a little bit about the psychological impact. By reference to drawing an analogy with CS gas, which did show sort of risk of PTSD on people who had CS gas used on them. In the context of our case that we brought before the High Court, this was one of the things that we really wanted government to have explored properly. Like, what is the impact of using or threatening to use PAVA spray on vulnerable children in custody? And again, there was a bit of a paucity of evidence, but they did commission some evidence from NHS England and from their lead psychologist. And actually, I think Rob has already put up one of our blogs in the chat. It's the one that's called Our 2 Days in Court. And if you go into that blog, you can link into that evidence, which, to be honest, is evidence that probably doesn't surprise anything. It is extremely traumatizing as somebody who may already have experienced significant trauma in their life to have pain inflicted on you by the person that has control over you. And that's not an affirming experience. So there was evidence. It was one of the reasons why NHS England was opposed to the rollout of PAVA in children's prisons, was because of the traumatizing impact and the psychological harm that it would cause. So I think, just in the interest of time, probably I could direct you to that. I think it's reading what the YCS's, the Youth Custody Services lead psychologist, said, and what NHS England said is probably, hearing it from the horse's mouth is probably most impactful. In terms of data, so as Katuna has said, there is a real lack of transparency on the use of force, the reasons for the use of force, the type of force, who it's used against in adult prisons. So it's much better in children's prisons, not perfect at all, but it is much better. In adult prisons, we don't have that data, despite it being long promised. Government committed to, in the context of a court case that was sponsored by the Equality and Human Rights Commission back in 2019 and 2020, that it would publish data on use of force in the same way as it does for children. It hasn't done that. It's 2026 now, so they're behind. They do collect data internally. And I completely agree with Katuna that I do not think it is difficult to collect that data. It does actually exist. That's why we have some effectiveness in terms of asking for FOIs, because the data is there. But until it's published and routinely published, it's not available to be scrutinized, and it therefore thwarts proper accountability. So I think we need to continue to press the MOJ to be doing better on the publication of data. It's just the first step. Like, we know we're going to see it, and we're going to see there's disproportionality, there's huge problems in terms of who receives what types of force and why. But until, the government did a big evaluation on the use of force. It looked at a 5-year period. Again, I believe Rob's linked to the evaluation in the comments. They did that work, and there's quite a big section in it on limitations of our findings, right? Like, they didn't look at religion, it didn't look at disability. It doesn't have a good understanding of the intersection of different protected characteristics and how that might change your experience of force. It doesn't understand well enough why people are hurt in the aftermath of force. It doesn't understand why certain types of force are favoured in certain establishments. There's all sorts of things that they don't have a handle on. And until they do, I don't think we can hope to improve the situation. Haven't quite answered the question about Muslim prisoners and people with disabilities. I'm very happy to have a conversation offline. If you want to drop us an email, we can talk about what specifically we've put in. I think quickly, religious data is collected, and therefore there's no reason why breakdowns shouldn't be able to be provided. Disability in prison is a bit harder. They do not collect data across the board, and therefore it's harder to point to disproportionalities, because it's just not a good understanding in the first place of how many people have disabilities and what disabilities people have. So disability is more difficult. But yeah, very happy to talk about it in the context
And
of...
do any of you have thoughts from Barry's question around independent monitoring bodies and incidents of violence? I mean, obviously, there is a huge variety, just like on all issues. There's a huge variation between independent monitoring bodies across the estate, dealing with lots of different things, I think is probably fair to say. Some of them are, I think, down to 2 or 3 people who are battling along to kind of monitor their jail and write their report to the Lord Chancellor every year. But have you seen anything? I mean, how much is I know they do, IMB members do look at footage, don't they, of different incidents. Do we see that making any difference?
Who are you asking, Andrea?
Any of you, Emma, Katuna. We'll give Mike this one off, unless he wants to add it in. Do you see, like, I mean, IMBs can be fantastic on some issues. I'm not sure I've seen much on use of force.
I'm happy to answer. So I think based on that's why I mentioned about the variety of implementing policy, because you go to different prisons and you see different ways of how things are done. I did not necessarily agree with the recommendation from the Lammy review about IMBs being exclusively seen as improving practice around racial disparities, which was the recommendation number 25, I believe. IMB members attending the use of force committees, and that's being seen as reducing disparities. I did not necessarily agree with this in the first place, because I think for me the issue is having people who have got lived experience of the particular incidents. But I have seen some good practice where people ask the right questions, but I have seen more practice where people are quite silent in terms of asking questions at those committee meetings. And I think it's about really standardizing what that recommendation was designed to do, and is it doing that? Because I believe we are coming to nearly 10 years since the publication of the Lammy review, and perhaps it's time to do another evaluation about, is that recommendation working alongside with others? Is that reducing racial disparities on use of force? What we know so far, it does not. So I think for me, it's an interesting one about answering the kind of question about different practices of different accountability mechanisms, because something works in somewhere but does not work. And that's why it becomes systemic. And I think that's my personal opinion, that systemically that recommendation is not working. And I would love to see any evidence to prove me wrong on this. I'll be happy to say I'm wrong. But unfortunately, that's what I see and hear.
I think we've answered all of the questions in the Q&A box. I think thank you to all of our panelists. We'll quickly come to Mike for a final comment. Mike, of what you've heard?
Yeah, so what Katuna just said, yeah, I think one good thing that could work is potentially a course that staff and prisoners have to do at the same time, to do around working together and finding alternative routes. Because if each other hears each other out to what they feel is the issue, then you're listening to each other, innit? You can understand where the other person's point of view is. Because ultimately, Tuna said about systemic racism and that, there's and the subtle racism, this unconscious bias that's just plagued now with like how they do it subtly, like going up to the one person, oh, it's time for you to leave now. But you keep going up to that one person. You need to ask yourself, why is it? Because there's a group of people there, but you seem to keep going up to that one person. What is that reason why you do that? Let's look into that. I think that could change a lot. Because just like when you have like an alcoholic and you're trying to change an alcoholic from, okay, what does alcohol give you? Oh, it gives me joy, it gives me this. And then you try to find alternative things that give you joy to take away the alcohol. It should be the same with, why do you commit violence? Why do you have this thing about that person? Right, let's find alternative routes. Is ultimately how you come to a safer environment.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you to Mike, to Gemma, to Katuna for sharing their experiences and their insights with us today. This has been, I think, a really powerful conversation, a difficult kind of confronting sort of subject matter, but really important. And I think it's right that we feel unsettled by it, because this is happening beyond public view, in spaces where people have very little decision-making power, very little credibility with the authorities, and can be sitting ducks, as Mike's described, with significant scope for impunity, which is why real scrutiny, data, accountability are all critical. And the Howard League, with our friends from ZMT and from Maslaha and other organisations, will continue to focus on this and hold government to account. We will definitely be continuing to oppose the weaponisation of prisons, for exactly the reasons that have already been set out in the comments sections, but also by our speakers, that violence really begets violence. The evidence such as it exists shows us that these weapons tend to escalate violence rather than diffuse violence. So my huge thanks to our speakers. Please thank also to Rob and Clara behind the scenes. We'll have another Spotlight event in a couple of weeks' time. Until then, please do take care and do stay in touch. If you're not a member of the Howard League, please do join the Howard League, and we look forward to staying in touch with you all. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.